because you're talking about a time of year when everything's changing. Leaves are falling off, hard mass is falling off, the natural browse is dying off, as you get into October. Because when those acorns are dropping, when those bucks are still grouped up, they're feeding on that stuff. And if you are able to capitalize on it when it's still fresh, that can be a great thing to kill a buck
Of
on.
the talking black oaks or red oaks, which one do you see the more preference that some of these whitetail would focus on specifically when season comes in?
So from what I see, it's the black oaks in early season. That's when you see what you can put a trail camera on it. You can see the feed sign under it in early season, and they will eat the red oaks. But the red oaks I more see in late season. Like if we'll get a snow in December, January, you can find a red oak and you can see where they've been digging in the leaves. So I don't know if they don't prefer them as much compared to the black and white oaks, because those are the ones where in late season they're kind of digging those up as a last resort. So maybe those lay on the ground or on the ground for a reason. I'm not really sure. But for sure in early season, it's kind of like a black oak, white oak scenario. So it just depends.
For hunting features in the mountains, that's something I've always thought is be fairly challenging, just because you're dealing with the topography, large landscape. There's a ton of different options, probably in a lot of places when it comes to like checking a bunch of trees. What is your thought process on that? Like, how are you going about walking like in season or a couple of days before season, kind of spot checking areas to figure out like where that sign's at when there's so much ground to cover?
So I would say an important part of it is deciding where the concentration of sign is at in relation to elevation. So I'm sure y'all have heard people talk about like sometimes the acorns are more in high elevation, sometimes they're lower elevation. I've heard that pertains to when we get an early or late frost. So if you get a late frost and the trees are budding out at the lower elevation and that kind of stunts or kills that growth, then the trees that bloom later at a higher elevation, those actually produce acorns. So sometimes you see more acorns in higher elevations. Sometimes you see them more in the bottoms. So that's typically when I try to do more of speed scouting. I don't get too locked in on one thing, because you're talking about a time of year when everything's changing. Leaves are falling off, hard mass is falling off, the natural browse is dying off. As you get into October. So I think it's an important time of year to just kind of be fluid with your scouting and not go into it with a mindset like I'm going to go into a white oak bottom, because what happens when you get to the white oak bottom and there's not a lot of sign. So it's a time of year when things are changing a lot. So it's just super important to cover a lot of ground, which everyone says, but you cannot underestimate just putting in a lot of walking. For instance, I got off work Wednesday, went out and walked public that I've hunted before, went all the way up to about 3,900 feet, just covering a lot of ground. Got all the way up there and found a bunch of poison ivy growing on the ground. It was all browsed down. Walked over the back side of that north ridge to the south side, found a trail, followed it, and I jumped 2 nice bucks bedded in a laurel thicket. So had I not made that trek all the way to the top to kind of see what the fresh sign was, I never would have jumped the bucks. Now I was looking to put a camera out, but at that point I didn't need to. I knew that they were in that area. So, and a lot of people, it's kind of like an old hunting or mountain lore. You hear if you jump a buck, you'll never see him again. I don't believe in that at all. Like, it didn't make my heart sink when I jumped the bucks up at 15 yards in front of me, because they waited till I got right in front of them. And one was shedded with white bloody antlers and one was still in velvet. They were really nice bucks too, but it didn't get me all flustered, because they'll be back. They're bedded there. They're used to running into things, not necessarily people out in the middle of nowhere, but that didn't bother me. So to answer your question, I would just say it's all about covering ground and being open to finding new sign, because things are changing constantly.
With that being the case of things are constantly changing, are you then, even during season, like a season opens next weekend right up here?
That's correct, yep.
So is that something that even after the first few days of the season, when you get some free time, you're still going to walk and try to see as things are happening and changing, what's the next, I guess, hot food source or where the deer are kind of shifting to?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I know a lot of people will hunt all day and sit in their stand, and that's a good thing to do, especially if you're confident where you're at, just staying in your tree. But oftentimes I get down and walk around and cover more ground. If I'm checking out a new piece of public, I might hunt till 10 or 11 o'clock, and if things are getting slow and maybe I get bored or whatever, I'll get down and just keep walking. Maybe I jump deer, maybe I see where they're feeding. But I think that in-season intel of just knowing what they're doing is really important.
Yeah, you bring up a really good point too, by the way, about everything changing this time of year, and it's all dynamic. And, out here we don't have crops that are getting cut. And that's like the big shakeup. The big shakeup, at least where we're from, and I imagine it's the same here, is when your leaves start falling and some of that ground cover starts dying back. Whether it's saplings that have leaves on them or it's some kind of grass that's growing up in the mountains or out in the woods, it's once that starts dying back, I feel like it concentrates them a little bit more. And I want to talk about that, but also I want to talk about one thing in particular, which is right here early in the season. It seems like red oaks are dropping before the white oaks are right now. Is that something that you would key in on? Let's say we fast forward a week and a half, 2 weeks, we're getting into season, and you're just kind of struggling to find those white oaks. Are you just shifting entirely to those red oaks, or are you just burning boot leather and just seeing what the sign tells you?
So that's a good point, and it depends on the sign, just like you mentioned. So some things that might be more subtle, like what I noticed scouting when I went out and walked last week, I found those areas where they were browsing, specifically on the poison ivy and a few other plants. I actually found 3 rubs, but they were super subtle. They weren't torn up trees, they weren't necessarily broken, but they were very subtle rubs because they are starting to lose their velvet, but the trees weren't scraped up. Like if you didn't walk right past them, you wouldn't notice, but the closer you look, you see the little shavings, kind of a broken branch or two. So that's where it's a lot more subtle. And then like a week or 2 ahead, like you're talking, that's when you start seeing the whip rubs, the cluster rubs. And that stuff is what you want to capitalize on when it's happening fresh. Because when those acorns are dropping, when those bucks are still grouped up, they're feeding on that stuff. And if you are able to capitalize on it when it's still fresh, that can be a great thing to kill a buck on.
Yeah, we interviewed a guy. By the time this comes out, it will have come out already. Chad Grove from West Virginia. And he was talking about an early season, a big challenge is when you're trying, especially that first week and a half, 2 weeks that you're hunting, it's kind of hard to key in on bucks based off of rubs and stuff like that because they haven't been out of velvet that long. Sometimes they're still in velvet when season opens up. Mm-hmm. And so they're just not laying down that sign. Is that something that you've kind of encountered or thought about? What's your thoughts on that?
So it goes from year to year, I would say. The rubs are sort of always consistent, but like last year, the last week of September, middle to last week of September, I went and did kind of a scouting walk in a particular area, and I was already finding laurel bushes ripped up, scrapes with urine in them. I actually have a picture of that. That was in my seminar. And a lot of people coordinate that with a heavier mass crop, which last year it was. There were white oaks everywhere. And you start seeing that more rut sign earlier, and I was like, okay, what is this? Like, there's a scrape here. It's the last week of September with urine in it. So that was kind of interesting, and I put a camera on that. And as far as like how important rubs are, I think they're important if they're fresh. Number one, it tells you deer are coming through there. They're spending time there. Sometimes it's nighttime sign, but if that is in conjunction with a food source, it tells you a buck group is moving through there because they might be split off into groups of 2 or 3 or 4, whatever, leading into like September, October. But it tells you bucks are there. So what I like to do is find the closest bedding area or what I presume to be the bedding area and find a trail coming from that. Because a lot of people try to focus on specific feed trees, and I'm sure that works great in other parts of the country. Where I live, where we're at right now, I've not had a lot of success sitting directly under a specific tree. And I know I gave an analogy in another podcast, but if I had the option to sit under a specific tree or choose the highway that's going to it, I'm going to sit on the highway by the bedding area, whatever trail I can find coming out of that, because I don't want to put my odds on a specific tree when I can sit a trail that I think's leading to it. So I know a lot of people don't like to hunt trails, but if it's fresh and it's being used, I will sit close to that.
Do you need to see some kind of rubs or some kind of other buck sign on that trail going to that feed tree? Or is it just kind of by, I guess, analyzing and looking at the situation based off the sign you're finding around those feed trees? You're just trying to figure out what the best exit route is or entrance route coming from some kind of bedding area?
I would say tracks and then also droppings, because a lot of times droppings are close to a bedding area or close to where they're hanging out for a long time, like close to a feed tree. That's when, so they might be walking on a trail, and most of the time trails and mountains are when they're forced to walk in like single file, whether it be around a terrain feature, alongside a creek, crossing a creek, and then the trail kind of dissipates. You can't follow a trail in the mountains for very long. I mean, most of them, it's like you find a trail, it might go for 50, 100 yards, and it's gone. because they don't have to walk on that specific point for very long. And normally it's paralleling the mountain, walking side hilling. You don't find them for very long going down. So that's just one thing. And then also I would just say the droppings and tracks. You can't underestimate that. If you're finding droppings in a concentration of tracks or tilled up ground, there's deer spending time there. It makes perfect sense. That's a good spot to set up.